Let's get reaction to that very story now. We're joined by Professor Patrick Bond, University of Johannesburg's distinguished professor and director of the Centre for Social Change. Prof, I hope it's a better line now. Let's start with, where we started, with what is taking place in Rafah, particularly in the context of what the ICJ had said, to Israel, especially when it comes to preventing those acts that may be viewed as genocidal acts. But now we're seeing the airstrikes that have now been launched in Rafah.
Yes, thanks for having me, Bongiwe. It is still so shocking to us all that even after the 15-2 vote in the International Court of Justice against the Israeli bombardment, the destruction of so many aspects of life that are quite plausibly a case of genocide, nothing has changed except the one thing that Israel did, which sort of axis of genocide, the US, the UK, Germany is supporting them on, is questioning UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency that supports hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. And by March, they may be out of money unless other countries step in. Other countries that have joined, those include Canada and the Netherlands. And in about a week, the International Court of Justice will hear a Nicaraguan claim against those countries. And meanwhile, as you say in Rafah, without a border opening to Egypt, it's mass murder. And I think because Egypt has just been brought into the BRICS last August by South Africa, it really is time to use that vehicle to try to get some relief to the masses of people undergoing genocidal attack.
And it's really concerning as to where do they go now. But let's segue from that to this conversation that is now unfolding in the US, the calls to review South Africa's relationship with the US. And I wonder if for you they come as a surprise given the recent developments that we've seen between, the nations and how there's been some unhappiness with certain positions that South Africa was perceived to be taking.
Yes, there are in fact 24 specific grievances that two members of the Congress, John James and Jared Moskowitz, have put forth to justify this review of bilateral relations, which could in turn threaten AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which gives trade benefits to especially the heavy metals and petrochemicals and automobile and grape and vineyard sectors. But these 24 include totally trivial and embarrassingly, let's say, dubious claims. For example, that universities, 6 of us, including my own, UJ, host a Confucius Institute where you learn Mandarin, you learn Chinese culture. I mean, these are the sorts of claims of somehow supporting not just the Palestinian cause, but specifically Hamas, the Iranian government, the Chinese government, and the Russian government. So if you recall from last year, consistent allegations about South Africa having some sort of arms transfer with the Lady R. And of course, South Africa has said, yes, maybe arms were brought in, but not arms given to the Russians. Many of these sorts of, let's say, long-standing disputes that became very hot last year are now being warmed up again, even though I think they were relatively clearly settled. South Africa wasn't in the wrong, at least in terms of the Lady R, and South Africa should have the ability, as a sovereign state, to deal with other states, including Iran. And so this is one of those areas where you can use the old-fashioned word to describe U.S. arrogance, and that word is imperialism.
And I mean, it's also, one of the complaints that they have now, they're saying that we seem to be taking a side with malign actors, as they call it. And they say that South Africa is not really sticking to its foreign policy of non-alignment as well.
Yes, South Africa's had a pretty chaotic foreign policy. Just as one example, 2 years ago, when on February 24th, 2022, the Russian government sent in troops, massive invasion of Ukraine, and the very first reaction by the South African delegation at the United Nations was to condemn it, but then that was pulled back. So let's say we have seen zigzagging and schizophrenic behavior, as you see with many of these middle tier countries, not just South Africa. And that means that what the US is trying to do with this bully boy approach, and it's not only these two, let's say, bipartisan members of the Congress, John James and Jared Moskowitz, it's something that's hardwired into U.S. Foreign policy interests. And that's why you often find with the African Growth and Opportunity Act and many other ways in which U.S. aid flows, even something as generally recognized as a global public good, which is the PEPFAR, that's the AIDS medicines that come to South Africa, those become political footballs. And it's because of the sort of, let's say, arrogance of U.S. power. I studied in the U.S. and I know that terrain in Washington very well. And I think South Africa has done extremely well by gathering lots of forces to say, actually, Israel is committing a genocide, and the U.S. is the main facilitator of that with all of the weaponry and the political and diplomatic support it gives them. Of course, that makes the U.S., I think, correctly saying this threatens national security and foreign policy because it really gives Washington a bloody nose.
So, Prof, how then does South Africa begin to deal with this? I mean, listening to what, DIRCO's Clayson Monyela said, that this is, something that is not, it's a bill that's not going to pass. And you look at what has been, the attitudes, for example, in the House of Representatives as well as the Senate, and the different views thereof of the Democrats and the Republicans. So how seriously does South Africa take this now?
Oh, I would take it quite seriously for the simple reason it's an election year, and the Republican-Democrat combination in the House, where there's a very slim Republican lead, might actually include this sort of clampdown on South Africa in the House. The Senate would be harder, it's democratically controlled, but there are many Democrats, including liberals who would have normally supported South Africa, who feel so strongly that they must do anything they can for Israel. And that includes genocide denialism and punishing South Africa for putting this out to the ICJ. And now there's going to be continuing court battles because of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and more cases at the ICJ. And then diplomatic relations, boycott, divestment, sanctions, a United Nations General Assembly vote might emerge to kick out Israel the way South Africa during apartheid was kicked out. All of these mean this is an election year going up to November, where it's going to be very testy and lots of hot politics and hot rhetoric will be heard from Washington and from these various politicians over there. And so I would be, not surprised in the least to see AGOA cancelled and more pressure from Washington. And I hope Pretoria and DIRCO and Clayton and Monyela and certainly Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor are going to gather more allies to stand up to Washington.
So do you think then this calls for that moment that, a number of people were talking about in the lead up to, the concerns whether or not AGOA would be renewed and what has been happening, especially when it comes to the foreign policy? Someone said, others saying that, some analysts saying that it is time to reimagine the relationship that South Africa has with the United States. And it's possible that now that may be the time, possibly.
I completely agree. I think on this, Bongiwe, it's critical because we're in stage 6 load shedding, and many of the exports that go to the US under AGOA, I mentioned steel and aluminium, petrochemicals, automobiles, they are guzzlers of electricity. They don't create many jobs in the process. It's very capital intensive economic activity. You compare that to labor intensive industry, to small businesses, to households, to women in households who use electricity so carefully. And I think actually if we can rethink AGOA, because it means perhaps we would do much better with electricity distribution and we wouldn't be so reliant upon a fickle foreign policy partner. And perhaps most importantly, most of those big companies that benefit from AGOA, they take their profits abroad. So I think a rethink and a just transition for the workers and communities affected, the way we're doing with climate-related just transition changes, that's a good opportunity to do so, not only for climate, for electricity access, but because to have that pressure point from the United States is very unhealthy for us.
So, Prof, how then does South Africa begin to reconcile some of these conversations? You're thinking about the conversation at the time when there was a whole lot of nervousness around AGOA and the business community that was coming out saying that you're going to impact us quite heavily, so you need to handle this very delicately. And looking at where we are finding ourselves now, because business is also likely again to say tread very carefully when it comes to this particular relationship, but there's most likely going to be the ongoing hostility that continue to bubble under. So how does South Africa at a practical level begin to handle this?
Well, you know, the strategy has been to have an alternative to our Western-oriented economic activities like the AGOA relationships. The next one under dispute will be called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It's a climate sanctions from the European Union and the UK that have been announced. They'll kick in 2026. So to me, the answer to those, let's say, relationships with the West that may make South Africa vulnerable is to ask, well, what are the interests of most South Africans? And I don't think they correspond with the interests of big business often. As I said, the electricity, the carbon intensity of our economy, these are the sorts of things that have always meant the West gets our raw materials or smelted metals, but we have to import ultimately goods from the West, or in this case from China. And it brings me finally to BRICS, because this is another dilemma, isn't it? Because how many members of BRICS are going to support South Africa? Only really Iran and Brazil. And the others, including the new ones, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, those are typically tied to US imperialism in the Middle East. India is. Ethiopia is. So 5 of the BRICS are basically lined up with the US and Israel. They are not making the changes that are going to be needed to put pressure on Israel to stop the genocide. And then you have 2 against, Iran and Brazil, where Russia and China have been a little bit on, let's say, the fence. China has major trade relations. Russia actually believes that, according to Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, the denazification that they argue justify their invasion also applies to the way in which Israel treats the Palestinians. Some of this, let's say, is hard to swallow, and it does mean, I think, time to rethink the BRICS. It's not really working on this most vital of foreign policy topics, because we have these big divisions that South Africa is not willing to, let's say, with Egypt on the Rafah border today, when it really counts, to help Palestinians escape the bombing.
And Prof, I was going to ask you about how then do you begin to deal with the dynamics and listening to what you're describing within BRICS Plus?
Well, the next big meeting, of course, the summit will be in November in Kazan, in the middle of Russia, but there are many meetings in between. And President Ramaphosa hosted such a meeting, a virtual meeting in November, to discuss the genocide, and he didn't get much out of it. And it's that old problem where, because the BRICS are sort of a very diverse group with extreme internal tensions, China and India, for example, and India being so pro-Israel, the other countries in the Middle East, UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, hoping to normalize with Israel once some sort of 2-state arrangement is made. It just means that if you want to call out genocide by Israel, you're not going to be able to do so within the BRICS. And I think it means maybe the non-aligned movement or the G77 or other allies, like we've seen from Colombia, from Chile, from Brazil, from progressive, let's say, pink-tide Latin American governments, may be the way we should be looking instead of towards the BRICS.